Okay, welcome back to Kevin Teaches Me. Today we're going to be going over some part one answers. So remember, in part one, you're going to definitely be asked one of two questions. The examiner is either going to ask you about what you're doing now, which means you'll be answering questions about your job or your studies, however you respond to, are you an employee or a student, or they're going to ask you questions about where you live. So today I'm going to give you some vocabulary and some idioms that we can use when we're talking about where we live. And I've told you again and again and again, idioms are quite difficult to use correctly. They have to be 100% on the mark, that's an idiom, to sound natural to a native speaker's ear. So I'm going to give you 10 or 12 today. These are Kevin approved, which means they sound normal to my ear. They are idioms that I will use. And I'm also going to give you some vocabulary that I think is advanced vocabulary, but not something that sounds strange. It's something a fluent speaker would see. So I'm going to be putting some things up on the screen, but if I'm moving too fast, if you don't catch everything, I'm going to leave a download link to the file below. And the file is going to have the word, the pronunciation, an explanation, as well as a sample sentence. So remember, it's really important for you to practice these words. Do not go into the IELTS exam and try to use them for the first time there. Okay? You must be practicing. And remember, you must be practicing a lot. So as always, if you find this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment about future videos or questions that you have. And please share the video to your friends and classmates and everyone else that you want to see succeed on the IELTS. So let's go to the screen. So as you can see, the following idioms are just to describe the general place where you live. And the first one I have is a stone's throw away. Now this literally means throwing a stone or a small rock, and you can hit something. So here we have my workplace is just a stone's throw away from my house. To me, this sounds very natural. For example, my house is just a stone's throw away from Longbean Bridge. I would say that. And you can use this when you're describing the convenience of a place. Oh, it's just a stone's throw away from the supermarket. Or you can use it when you're describing general location, like I just did with Longbean Bridge. I'm a stone's throw away from the old quarter. Something like that. Our next idiom, and similar to a stone's throw away, is on the doorstep of. Again, this indicates something very close. If you don't know, a doorstep is the stone or rock that used to be in front of a house, in front of the door. It's where you could take off your shoes or clean your shoes or stand when you knocked on the door. So to say something is on the doorstep of means it's really close. So to use my previous example, I am on the doorstep of Longbean Bridge. The example here, their apartment is on the doorstep of the city park. It's perfect for morning walks and picnics. That lets me know that it is very, very, very close. So your house or your doorstep might be, or your apartment, might be on the doorstep of many things. And again, we're really talking about, at least when I use this, talking about convenience, how easy it is to get to something, that where I live is very conveniently located because it's on the doorstep to many things that I need in my everyday life. Okay, I have to warn you, this next idiom, nestled in, is a little stranger to use, and you have to be a little more careful because there are certain things implied. Nestle means to burrow in. Maybe a baby nestles into your neck when you hold it. So to say that something is nestled in, or nestled between, or nestled beside really implies cozy, sheltered, secure, safe. It also implies, I think, something small. You wouldn't say Hanoi is nestled in the Red River Valley. Hanoi is way too big to nestle anywhere. But a smaller village could be nestled in the mountains. Maybe you could say Hoi An is nestled by the sea. Hoi An's small enough to nestle. Hoi An's very picturesque. It's very romantic. So to use the word nestle, it would work for a smaller town like that. If you're from a small village, you could use nestled. My village is nestled in some rice paddies. My village is nestled next to a stream or a lake. You could use that. You have to be careful with nestled, though. Going back to what I said earlier, it's really easy to make idioms sound strange. Another one that describes general location is around the corner. Now, if you know how most Western cities, at least in America, are designed, they're designed on a grid system. So we have streets meeting at 90-degree angles. So when you say something is around the corner, you literally mean you go up, turn left or right, and it's right there. But we don't really use it literally. It's an idiomatic phrase meaning that something is really close. For example, again, where I live in Long Bien, in Hanoi, there is a duck restaurant that I love to go to. And it's very close, and I would say it's just around the corner from where I live. That doesn't literally mean it's around the corner. In fact, because it's Hanoi and there are many alleys, it's around several corners. But it's close enough that I can say it's around the corner. And that works. It's an idiomatic phrase. And it's used to describe your closeness to something. Again, we would use this phrase, or I would use this phrase, talking about the general location of my apartment. If I said, oh, I live in Mipek, and they said, well, I don't know where that is. Oh, it's just around the corner from Nguyen. Oh, okay. It gives them a little more information to be able to place where I live. Next, we have in the heart of. And again, this is going to be used to give yourself or to give your listener more information about where you're living, where you are living, where your house or apartment is located. You could say, I live in the heart of Hanoi. To me, that means you live in the old quarter. Because it's the core. If you look at the description here, it describes a location that is situated at the center or core of an area. Your heart is here. It's what keeps you living. So if we transfer that to a city, it means the busiest section of the city. In Hanoi, it might mean the oldest section of the city, or the first section of the city, or the city that everything else has grown out of. In Hanoi, that would be the old quarter. It doesn't have to be just the city. I could say I live in the heart of Long Bien, or you live in the heart of your village. You're near the schools, the hospital, the market, everything you need. It's going to be the busiest area. That's what it's going to be. That's what it means living in the heart of something. Usually, we're talking about a larger area. I guess you could say the heart of Vietnam. To me, the heart of a country would be central location. So maybe Hue and Da Nang would be the heart of Vietnam. In America, the Midwest, Missouri, Illinois, Kansas would be the heart of the country. It's the center of the country. It doesn't necessarily imply busyness when you're talking about a country. When you're using it as for a city, I think it does imply busyness, though. The next idiom I think is really useful for Vietnam because we have a lot of multi-generational homes here. And remember, when I say multi-generational homes, I'm talking about several generations of people living under the same roof. So you might be living with your grandparents and your parents. Or if you have children already, you might be living with your children and your parents and maybe your grandparents. It's a multi-generational house. And you could tell the examiner that my family all lives under the same roof. It's idiomatic, but we do literally mean the same roof of the house. It's really useful, I think, in Vietnam because it's a good way to describe your living situation. And quite honestly, I've never heard it in an IELTS exam. So those are some idioms that would probably be most useful in an urban area. Even things like in the heart of, yes, you could say that about your village, but if there's only 4 streets in your village, it's kind of confusing when you say in the heart of, because a lot of times small towns don't really have a heart in the same way that big cities do. But I have some idioms that could be used to describe more rural living. And as a quick aside, remember that urban and rural are adjectives, so we always need an object. You live in an urban area or a rural area. A lot of times students want to say, I live in urban or I live in rural, and that's incorrect. I need an object there. So my first idiom is off the beaten path. Now, if you imagine a road that people use or a walking path that people use again and again and again and again, it gets beat down. There's no more grass. There's no more plants. It's kind of dirt and mud. Maybe eventually it turns into stone. The beaten path is the well-used path. So if you live off the beaten path, you live in an area that maybe not a lot of people go to. For example here, our cabin is off the beaten path, nestled deep in the forest. So I've used both off the beaten path and nestled in this example. And it is an example of something that's hard to find. You're not going to walk across this cabin in your day-to-day living, right? You need to find it. So how could we use it in Vietnam? Again, maybe if you live in a small town, in a less traveled province, where there's just not a lot of travelers, you might say you live off the beaten path. If you live in an area where the only people coming to that area live there or have family there, you might say you kind of live off the beaten path. It just means you're not getting a lot of traffic. You're not getting a lot of people coming there. You're a little more remote. And you have to be careful because just because you're far away doesn't mean you're off the beaten path. For example, I'm thinking Ha Giang is quite far from Hanoi. It's quite far north, but I wouldn't call Ha Giang off the beaten path anymore because there's so many tourists that go there. There's so many people that go there every year. Maybe there are some smaller villages up near Ha Giang that have been overlooked, that don't get a lot of travelers. So even though they're close to a touristy area, they're not getting a lot of traffic. Okay, those could be considered off the beaten path. The next idiom is something we use quite a lot in my area of America because where I live in America, it's a very rural area. So to say that something is in the middle of nowhere means there's nothing else around. Like, I went to high school in a very small town, a very small high school, maybe only 2,000 people in the town. I would say that my high school was in the middle of nowhere. There's a lot of places in Vietnam that are still in the middle of nowhere, but we're probably talking countryside or mountain areas. You have to be careful. Vietnam has a lot of people, so it's harder to be in the middle of nowhere. But maybe something could feel like the middle of nowhere. If we go back, it was off the beaten path. It really felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. That's okay. You could say that. But it's used to describe something that is isolated, something that there's not a lot of things around, or something that feels isolated, or feels like there's not a lot of things around. On the outskirts. On the outskirts means on the outer edge of. So we can talk about being on the outskirts of cities, of towns. Imagine where the houses start going away and the countryside comes in. That would be the outskirts. A couple of years ago, if I remember correctly, when I first moved to Hanoi, Ba Vie was not part of Hanoi. Now it is, but it's definitely on the outskirts of Hanoi because there's a lot of farmland between here and there. You have to drive quite far. It's very far away from the heart of the city. It's on the outskirts. And I would say this is pretty much the opposite of the previous idiom, in the heart of the city. Here's another one that can be used when we're talking about an urban area, and that's in the middle of the action. It refers to living in a location that's vibrant, that's bustling with activity, that's chaotic. For example, their apartment is right in the middle of the action, with shops, restaurants, and theaters just steps away. It's a good thing for most people. A lot of times, young people like to live in the middle of the action. Older people, not so much. They prefer to live in quieter areas. So you could say that you live in the middle of the action if you're in Hanoi, near a university, near the heart of the city. You could say that you want to live in the middle of the action, or you'd like to live. Or, on the opposite end, if you're a quiet person, if you like your space, you could say, I prefer to be far away from the middle of the action. Similar to the middle of the action is in the thick of it. Describes living in the midst of a busy or chaotic environment. If you live in Hanoi, except for some neighborhoods, you're always in the thick of it. The old quarter is in the thick of it. Even some of the busier roads in other districts, you're always in the thick of it. So we can use this to describe where we live if we live in a busy environment, if we live in a noisy environment, or quite honestly, if we just live in an environment where there's a lot available to us, we can use this. So those are all idioms that we can use. Again, I've already told you this, but I'm going to go back and say it again. Idioms are very hard to use properly. And I want to let you know, and you can refer to my videos on the IELTS test and how speaking lexical resource is graded. Your speech does not have to be full of idioms for you to get a band 7. Just a few idiomatic phrases and a few good adjectives, good vocabulary words is enough to get you a band 7. I tell my students this again and again. Lexical resource is only 25% of your grade, so don't put too much stress on it. I did a really interesting experiment the other day using ChatGPT, where I had it give me a pretty good part 2 answer. And then I told ChatGPT to use more idioms. I gave it to my students, and I said, which one is better? And they loved the one with all the idioms. And they said for lexical resource, I would give this a 9 for lexical resource. Well, I told them that I probably would have given it a 6 because there were so many idioms in this answer that it stopped to make sense. It stopped making sense. That's a problem and a danger when you use lots of idioms and idiomatic phrases, because if you use too many of them, it's simply impossible to tell what you're actually talking about. So remember, less is more. Idioms are like the salt on your food, right? You don't need to use that many to get a really good score. And also, refer to my previous videos about the differences between idioms and idiomatic language. There's a big difference, and IELTS only talks about one. But that being said, let's move on to some adjectives that we can use. And the first adjectives that I have can describe where you live. For example, urban. We probably all know that. Hanoi is an urban area. We have suburban. This is a little more difficult because of the difference in the way cities in Vietnam are built. Suburban in America, literally suburban, are those areas between urban spaces and rural spaces. So they don't have the big tall buildings. They might not have everything that the urban city has, but it's where a lot of people live and they commute to work. Commute means drive to work. I don't know of any areas in Hanoi that I would consider suburban. Maybe a town, a small town outside of Hanoi that you must drive to Hanoi to work, to go to school, to go to the hospital. That might be a suburban area. But Hanoi is very big. And if you live in Hanoi, you live in an urban area. The best you could do is say that you live in a quieter area of Hanoi, or perhaps you live on the outskirts of Hanoi, to use the idiom we used before. But suburban areas are just, as far as I have seen, rare in Vietnam. The next adjective, of course, is rural, and remember, we need an object there. So a rural area, a rural village, a rural town. To me, rural means very few people, just a few thousand. If your town has 100,000 people or 200,000 people, I don't consider it rural anymore. To me, that's a city. And I think coming from America, we have different definitions there. That would definitely be a city. Many people say that, I live in a rural village. To me, a village has 1,000 people, 2,000 people. That could just be the differences in America versus Vietnam. But a rural area would work. If you live in a rural area, it might be scenic. For example, living in a mountain village would be very scenic. It just means picturesque. It's full of beauty. Hoi An is a scenic area. Da Nang is a city, but it's very scenic because you have the mountains, you have the peninsula, you have the ocean. So you can use this in a lot of different ways. And I would rather hear scenic than picturesque. I hear picturesque a lot. I also hear beautiful landscapes a lot. Well, scenic is an adjective that I don't hear a lot that means beautiful landscapes. This next adjective is a little harder to use. It's like the idiom nestled in, and it's a word pronounced quaint. Quaint means charming, cozy, old-fashioned, and it's definitely harder to use properly, but it's something that I never hear, really. My example is Hoi An. I think Hoi An is quaint. There's a lot of people going through. It's not necessarily quiet, but the buildings are old. It's a place you go to take lots of photographs. Even parts of the old city in Hanoi can be considered quaint. So if you're talking about a place you live and describe it as quaint, it certainly means things in my head. And like a lot of these adjectives, it would be very good, and it's almost essential that you explain what you mean. Because when you say scenic, it doesn't really tell me why you say scenic. When you say quaint, it doesn't really tell me why you say quaint. You need to paint a picture for me, and you need to use more vocabulary to tell me what you mean. Which is good for you, because if you're extending your answer by describing things, that's good for you. You're explaining what you mean. If I know you know the definitions of what you're saying, that's going to help your coherence score. And it's a win-win all around. So don't forget to explain what you mean in these words. Now I have some adjectives describing your apartment or house itself. And the first one I've selected is spacious. If you have a lot of room, your apartment can be spacious. Like me and my mom and dad live in a 3-bedroom apartment, so it's quite spacious. Of course, in urban areas like Hanoi, spacious places are rare. So perhaps if you live in a house in the countryside, or if you have a big garden, a lot of area around your home, it could be spacious. Again, you must explain what you mean. You can't just say, my house is spacious. What do you mean by spacious? Because we may have different definitions of what spacious is. Cozy is the next word I've selected, and it's pretty much the opposite of spacious. Cozy means warm, comfortable, inviting. So a lot of times, if students tell me their favorite room in their house is their bedroom, I say, why? Well, the blankets are very warm, my bed is comfortable, the lights are low, I have my books in there, my cat comes in to sleep with me. What they're describing is a cozy atmosphere. Their room is cozy, and that's why they like to stay there. Cozy, think warm, small. A warm blanket is cozy in the wintertime. So if we can draw that out to describe a room, we have a cozy room. But you must describe it to me. You must describe it to me. Well lit. If your house has a lot of windows, it could be well lit. Lets in a lot of sunlight. That's a problem in some houses in Vietnam. Apartments are usually well lit. You could describe your apartment as well lit. If you want to describe a change you would like to make your apartment or house, I would like more windows, so it's more well lit. It would improve my mood. This is a good word to describe the lighting in your house or apartment. And again, if you give me more information about the windows, about the big doors that you open into the garden, it really paints a picture for me, and it really makes you sound more coherent as you're giving me more information. We have modern next. If you're talking that your house or apartment is modern, we're really talking a very contemporary design. It would be the opposite of traditional, right? If I go to the countryside, a lot of times people have very heavy wood furniture in their living room. It's not very comfortable to me, but it's very pretty to look at. I would say that's a very traditional design. On the other hand, a lot of apartments are very modern. They have modern lighting. They have lots of windows. There's lots of glass. There's lots of cool colors. There's lots of modern design, leather furniture, comfy furniture. That's modern design. A lot of apartment blocks are modern. Some houses I've seen going up are very modern, but it would be the opposite of traditional. And here we have traditional. A lot of the houses I've been in the countryside are very traditional. It doesn't mean they're ugly. It doesn't mean they're old. It doesn't mean they're falling in. It just means They are traditionally designed. They look the same as houses do in the past. It is completely neutral. So you can't use traditional as a negative adjective. You can't use modern as a negative adjective unless you give me more information. But traditional is the opposite of modern. And from what I see, traditional is more used in the countryside. In the city, we tend to go toward a more modern design. Well-maintained is an adjective we could use. And I think this is especially true if we come from the countryside. You could say, well, my great-grandfather built my house, but it's well-maintained, so my family is still very happy living there. Well-maintained means it has been kept up. Repairs have been made as things have broken. There's new paint, there's new windows, there's a new roof. There are no big problems with the house. So it's a good thing. My house is very old, but it's well-maintained, so we are still very happy living there. And we're going to live there for a long time. Ooh, inviting is a good adjective. And it kind of reminds me, earlier we talked about cozy. So if you're describing your house, think when you walk through the door, you see the living room. And my living room is very inviting because I have a very big, comfortable couch, and I have a tea set on the table for people to sit down and have a nice cup of tea. It's very well lit. There's lots of plants around. So that would be inviting. It's a place that visitors want to come in, sit, and talk. It's welcoming to people. If you're a younger person, and maybe a person living in a multi-generational house where your family is all under one roof, you might say that your room or your house is an eclectic design. Eclectic just means a blend of different designs. So, for example, if your grandma and grandpa are very traditional, and they like their Vietnamese art, and they like their Vietnamese furniture, and your mom and dad, they use some of the traditional stuff, but not all, and you love very modern design, lots of metals and glass and different fabrics and different cultures, different colors, then the design of your house would be eclectic. It's a mix. This is very important, though, like some of the other adjectives I've given you. You must explain what you mean. If you just tell me, my house is very eclectic, I don't have enough information, and it's not going to get you the points that you think it is, because I'm not sure if you know the meaning of the word. If you explain what you mean, it's going to improve your coherence, it's going to improve my understanding of you, and it's going to give you a better vocabulary score because you're extending your answer and probably using more complex sentences. And that's the last vocabulary word I have for you. Remember, these are a lot of advanced vocabulary, but we can still stack them and use them again. For example, my apartment is very eclectic. My parents use traditional furniture. I use modern design. Okay, we use 3 in one sentence, and that's terrific. I'm not done with my answer there, right? I have to explain what I mean. Adjectives are a little easier to stack than idioms. You can really overdo idioms quickly. So try not to use too many idioms or idiomatic phrases in this section of the test. I wouldn't say, my house is right on the doorstep of Koh Long Bi Inn and just a stone's throw away from a coffee shop, and I can't even remember. It's already too much. It's already too much. You have to be selective about your idiom use. Adjectives are easier to stack, but do it carefully. Don't say, my apartment is an eclectic, well-lit, well-kept, traditionally designed house in the countryside. It's too much. But you can break those things up. My apartment is well-lit and inviting. My parents like a traditional design, so it's more traditional in that sense. However, in my room, I like modern things. Okay. I would need to develop that more, but we're using good adjectives and we're using them in a natural way. When we're talking, we're very rarely putting 3 or 4 adjectives on top of one another. You could do that, you'd sound strange. I don't think you'd get the points you want to get, because it would sound like these words were memorized as opposed to used naturally and as opposed to you knowing the full meaning of them. So as always, happy studying. Remember, I have faith in you. I know you can get a very, very, very good score on the IELTS. So don't worry, just study, study, study. Learn these words and use them. Try and use them. And try and notice where they are used when you're watching TV and reading English, okay? So I wish you all luck in your studies. Please leave me a comment about what video you would like me to make next. Also, the link to this document is down below me, so feel free to download it. If you have any questions, leave a comment. And until next time, happy studying.